When you're working with someone with a neuromuscular condition, there'll be occasional situations which could become emergencies. It won't be every day, but it's important to know what to do if it does happen. John Ray Hasty has Duchenne muscular dystrophy.
I think the first thing to say about emergencies is that I don't have many, and it's I think some new PAs may think that this is a really quite a dangerous situation, that there's going to be countless emergencies that they're going to have to deal with, and in reality, that isn't the case.
Later in this series, we'll be talking about all the different equipment and strategies that are used to make life run smoothly. But first, let's look at the things that can happen unexpectedly and would present risk. You as a PA can act promptly in the moment, learn to anticipate problems, and, if possible, talk to your employer in advance about what you would do to resolve these eventualities. By understanding these things, you can avoid making them worse than they need to be. We'll look first at medical emergencies. Separately from this training series, you should ensure you've received accredited first aid training. We're now going to talk about some situations that you might need to use that first aid qualification, and how having a neuromuscular condition might affect that situation for the person you work with. Karen Wood is a neuromuscular care advisor who supports and advises many people with neuromuscular conditions at home.
Respiratory, orthopedic, cardiac, bowels, gastro, that would be the four big ones that I come across most times.
In a later module, we'll be talking in detail about the day-to-day and routine needs of people who use respiratory support and ventilation. One of the most critical emergencies you might face as a PA is if you work with a person who needs support to help them breathe, and that isn't working, either because of a problem with the equipment or because that person's ability to breathe has suddenly deteriorated.
Obviously, anything where the ventilator goes wrong becomes an emergency just because I'm dependent on it. So, for example, the tube of the ventilator can easily become disconnected, and then an alarm will sound on the ventilator to alert you. Usually, if the PA is in the same room, it's just a case of me telling them if they're not aware of what's happened and what they need to do. And that's often just reconnecting the tube, which can be quite a simple thing. But obviously, if it's missed, then it becomes an emergency.
Most people have a backup vent, so that's not too much of an issue. They'll get in contact with their respiratory centre, get that sorted. Most people should be, if they have a vent, listed on their electricity company's priority, so that if there is a power cut, that they are seen as a priority to get power to in some way or shape or form. So most houses with medical requirements of equipment should be on those.
Spare equipment in a dedicated box in my room, spare everything that's needed, and I also have 2 ventilators. And when I'm going out, I always take the spare one with me. So it's about the PA knowing where the other ventilator is and knowing, like, if there's a situation that they can't identify the cause of, the focus is just to get me breathing.
When someone's muscle weakness makes swallowing hard, that can interfere with their breathing, and they may aspirate, which is when the food goes down the airway, or choke, when there is a blockage in their airway that stops them breathing altogether. Different people will have different strategies for dealing with this.
I have a couple of ways to deal with that. I've got a manual kind of anti-choking device called a life pack that you just push down on my face and release, and it kind of, it's meant to dislodge anything that's stuck in the airway. I also have my cough assist that can also be used in an emergency to kind of apply significant pressure onto the airway to shift anything that might be dislodged. Often I'm not like fully choking, so I'm not. It's like if a bit of food goes down the wrong way, it doesn't completely block my airway, but it does cause me to cough, and if I start coughing and I can't clear it, that can gradually worsen over time and then cause me to choke. So the strategy for that is for me to lie flat, and that allows me to breathe safely while I'm able to kind of clear the obstruction in the airway. So yeah, I mean that's what works for me.
Bacterial infections and viruses that cause coughs and colds can severely impact someone with reduced lung function. This can happen surprisingly rapidly, so that they would urgently need more help than the respiratory equipment they normally use.
It's obviously, if it's about respiratory management, and for me, actually, it's about averting those sorts of emergencies. So I always have a chat with the people that I support, saying, look, actually, if you get a bit of a snuffle and you know better or know different within 48 hours, that's when we've already got, normally my people I support would have a mechanism within the GP for prophylactic antibiotics, or even they hold them at home sometimes, just to get that done. And then obviously we try and get in contact with their respiratory centres, get them monitored beforehand, because what we don't want is that sudden drop off and they feel there's an emergency and have to get to hospital.
Another reason your employer might need to go to hospital would be if a fall or slip leads to a bone fracture or a blow to the head. In everyday life, as much as you can take steps to do things as safely as possible, these accidents and injuries can happen.
If you've got some level of mobility, and even if you haven't, if you slipped off something when you've been transferring or something's gone wrong with the hoisting, is about slips, trips, bumps, fractures. They're things that need to be looked at. And as everything says, if you've had a fracture and you've got neuromuscular condition, we need to make sure that it's fixed appropriately. So if it's something that you currently had movement in, we need that fixed so you get movement back in it as quick as possible.
Because there will be a lot of times when you'll be instrumental in moving the person you work with, it's possible that something you're helping with could lead to this kind of accident. It isn't necessarily your fault. If you're involved in whatever resulted in injury, then it's completely natural for you to feel bad. In that moment, try not to dwell on your feelings of guilt, because that can distract you from promptly doing something to help the situation. Remember that accidents happen, and there'll be time later to apologise and go over what could have been done different. Don't make it worse by panicking or blaming yourself. Falls can also result in head injuries, which can be serious for anyone and shouldn't be ignored.
Because neuromuscular is under the umbrella of neurology, is the fact we don't like people banging their heads. And that's what happens in a lot of cases, is people have a fall or a bump and they bang their heads and they need to get checked out. Just obviously anybody who bangs their head should be having looked at. And obviously, because the heart's a muscle, there are occasions where you might get, palpitations and things like that associated to certain conditions that have elements of cardiac issues with them. And it's just the fact that if they're occurring, we need to get them looked at and get them monitored. And most people, if that's a part of their condition, would be having those monitored anyway. But it's just about going back to their specialist teams and saying, we've had a few symptoms, can we be seen a bit quicker, or can we have that reviewed, etc., etc. When you don't have a great deal of mobility, it's very common to have problems with your bowels, problems with constipation. And if you have problems with your bowels that are very sluggish and don't move, and you don't move a great deal, sometimes you can have problems where you get pseudo blockages where there's a problem with the bowels. They can be quite painful and they can be quite difficult, so they need to be monitored, which is, then again, if you look at it prophylactically, my biggest thing is the minute you're not very mobile, we have a look at making sure that you are managing your bowels effectively, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen.
Your employer will most likely be their own advocate in many emergencies. They will know what to do, and you will be able to follow their lead. By doing this, they can maintain their independence and autonomy. If the person you work with is conscious and able to communicate, follow their instructions. If they lose consciousness, or you can't understand what they're asking for, and they're in immediate danger, call 999 without delay.
A lot of it is down to whether or not I can communicate. So if I can communicate and I can give instructions and I'm kind of actively giving instructions of what to do, then I wouldn't want the PAs to be calling 999. I'd want them to be listening to me and following my instructions, because often it's more important that you can do that than you can actually call an ambulance, which might take time to arrive, when actually quick intervention by listening to me can make all the difference. So I think it's more if I can't communicate, and this has a situation that hasn't happened before, and they don't know what to do to fix it, then that's the point at which you would call 999, I think, or if I told them to.
People with neuromuscular conditions know that there is, if it's not that first chest infection, it's their second one, they know they're going off. And actually they're very aware of that, because when you ring the ambulance service, they'll say, are they breathing, are they talking? You may be now, but 15 minutes from now you might not be, because that's how weak you'll get from trying so hard.
Emergency services will need to escalate the situation due to the patient also having a neuromuscular condition. There will be mechanisms in place to do that, and communicating the full situation is key.
There are mechanisms within the ambulance services to make the control rooms aware of the particular issues you have, because sometimes you, particularly with a neuromuscular condition, if you've got a bit of an upset with your breathing, you're not really able to lay flat. You definitely can't lay on one of those horrible hospital ambulance trolleys. It just doesn't work. So it's about how we get, there are mechanisms in place, most people in that situation, to get them in and get them monitored if we need to. Particularly if you're in an emergency where you do need to go to A&E and you can't get in an ambulance because there are no wheelchair locking points in an ambulance. That's the whole point about it getting escalated to a call centre supervisor, so that they can arrange an ambulance escort for you, because then technically you're still going in by ambulance even if you're driven in by somebody else. So it bypasses you having to wait in A&E.
The person you work with will be the expert in their own condition and will have the knowledge and experience to tell others what they need. However, there will be times when the type of emergency makes it harder for them to be listened to or to speak for themselves, and you can be their advocate in those situations if they ask you to. Their specialist medical teams will also be able to assist if they need to go to A&E.
That's why I'd always suggest you contact your specialist team, although everyone is their own specialist and their own, they know their condition well. It's very common that some medical people have never heard of it and then don't like looking silly, so they won't necessarily listen, and it is about literally maybe just having some backup in that, saying, well, actually, this is what needs to happen, because sometimes they'll take that from somebody who has a title that specialises in the area than the person who actually affects is in their own specialist.
Other types of emergencies you need to consider relate to the environment rather than the health of the person directly. The most serious of these is the possibility of fire.
It's about having every house, whether it has somebody with a neuromuscular condition in it or otherwise, should still have a fire evacuation plan in place, and it's learning what that is.
For a person with limited mobility, the evacuation plan will cover how you will quickly move them to safety.
There are evacuation methods that can get people down the steps. They're not particularly comfortable for the individual involved, but they get you out safely. So it is that trade-off in that horrible event where if there is a fire, is the fact that you need to get away from the fire as soon as possible.
If you are the only non-disabled person in the house, you may also need to deal with other household emergencies, such as plumbing, heating, and electrical faults. This is important for the safety and well-being of the person you work with, but you need to balance their immediate personal needs with the urgent problem you're handling.
Obviously, the prime importance for me would be that the person with the neuromuscular condition was safe and felt secure. So wherever they were, be that in their chair, be that in the bed or wherever, it's the fact that we know that they're safe and they're manageable.
I think in terms of more everyday emergencies that everyone might experience, I think the important thing for BAs is to always be mindful of my needs as the priority. So, obviously, if there was some kind of like household emergency that I might need them to help with, I think they would always need to be kind of mindful that I am on the ventilator and I can't be kind of like left on my own, and understanding that emergencies with a ventilator can happen at any time. So you've always got to have that in mind. I think it's very easy for a PA to get caught up in a kind of crisis situation in the home and actually forget that all the existing needs that I have are still there and need to be kind of taken care of.
The primary importance is while you're dealing with whatever the issue may be, is making sure, because that person with neuromuscular condition may not be able to move or do anything for themselves, that you still have to attend to what their requirements are, keep them safe and keep them as calm as possible as well, because anxiety is a massive issue, particularly if you fatigue.
Finally, remember that you are as vulnerable to accidents and emergencies as anyone else. Your own safety and well-being are important, not just for yourself, but as part of your role in keeping your employer safe, because they are physically dependent on you. You can avoid harming yourself in accidents by taking care of the things that you do and by following procedures. You can also preempt emergencies which might be caused by your own health by talking to the person you work with if you are ever feeling unwell or if you're struggling with something. It is much better to avoid a situation where you suddenly become unable to help that person with a neuromuscular condition who's relying on you. They may have strategies for calling for extra help if anything happens to you, and that might be their phone or voice-activated device. So you should also recognise that these technologies, which many use for fun, are an important part of their safety and security and should always be available to them. In this module, we've heard about the medical eventualities that could lead to an emergency for a person with a neuromuscular condition, some of the steps you might take as a PA to help avoid and resolve them, and how to manage your own reaction in a stressful situation. We've learned about how to support the person you work with to advocate for themselves, when it's appropriate to advocate for them, and what outside help and expertise might be available. We've also considered fire evacuation procedures, how to handle household emergencies, and how to balance the extra needs of your employer in an emergency situation that you are dealing with while at work.